My name is John Cornell. I'm an adjunct with the Center for Totalitarian Studies at the Pilecki Institute, and I've been asked to talk today about the United Nations War Crimes Commission, something which archives which we have had at the Pilecki Institute for 10 years now, and which we have just opened to the public. So the UNWCC, as it is known, was set up during the Second World War as a body of experts in international law, lawyers, jurists, experts, many of whom were from occupied Europe and found themselves in London as exiles at the time. It was established in October of 1943 and carried out extensive work documenting Axis war crimes and refining legal instruments for pursuing post-war justice until it was shut down abruptly in March of 1948. Now, because of Cold War politics, the work of the UNWCC remained hidden from the public afterwards, with its archives sealed, while the achievements of its team of experts was largely eclipsed by the far more public and politically expedient Nuremberg trials. The archives of the UNWCC only became fully available to researchers after 2014, thanks to the unremitting pressure from Dan Plesch of the University of London and other researchers. Since then, the UNWCC archives have been available in digitized form in just a few locations, including the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Wiener Library in London, SOAS, and here at the Pilecki Institute in Warsaw. Now, thanks to the efforts of our archive section, the entire UNWCC archive is available online as part of the Pilecki Institute's online archives. My colleague Aleksandra Kozicka will describe the archive shortly. So because of its brief history, after all, it existed less than 5 years, its abrupt closure and suppression, and the disappearance from public view, the UNWCC has until recently figured very little in histories of the war, in debates on wartime atrocities, including the Holocaust, or in discussions on international law. This negligence of the UNWCC marks both a serious gap that needs to be addressed, and at the same time, I think, is evidence of certain severe political vulnerabilities that have always undermined the pursuit of justice for war crimes and which really continue to do so to this day. So my presentation is going to be divided into two parts. At first, I will describe the genesis of the UNWCC as part of a historical process and as part of a political struggle. And the second part will concern the work of the UNWCC itself, how it functioned, what it accomplished, and what it offers to researchers. Here is a photograph of Sir Cecil Hurst, the first chairman of the UNWCC, and also formerly a member of the Permanent Court of International Justice. The UNWCC, in the context of international law, war crimes, and wartime politics. Now, the UNWCC came about in response to certain critical challenges that were brought about by Nazi atrocities perpetrated in the course of the Second World War and the German occupation of Europe. Up to the Second World War, international law had been shaped largely by the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions, which had been concerned above all with regulating the conduct of warfare and treatment of combatants, including safeguarding the rights of POWs and care of the wounded. And other treaties and conferences also contributed, such as the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, renouncing the use of warfare to settle disputes, which somewhat paved the way for the thoughts about the crime of aggression. And all of these had been shaped in response to the wars of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So the Second World War and the brutal occupation regime of the Nazi Party necessitated a whole new understanding of what war crimes were and how international law needed to be strengthened and expanded to answer this new, more radical reality. Crimes were being committed by the occupying powers, whether by their leaders, by soldiers, security forces, occupying administrations or by fifth columnists and ordinary citizens that had little or no precedence in prior European conflicts. So the genesis of the UNWCC has to be viewed both as a continuation of all these pre-war developments, such as the Hague and Geneva Conventions, but also as a response to wholly new and unprecedented situations. Now, looking at the dates of the UNWCC, I think it is always striking how late in the war it started. It was not established until October of 1943, and in fact, did not even begin work until January of 1944, fairly close to the end of the war. So it's 4 years after the first atrocities of the German invasion and occupation of Poland had occurred, and the atrocities of the occupation had been continuous. And of course, 1 year or so after the Warsaw Ghetto itself had been completely cleared and most of its occupants murdered in Treblinka. So by the time the UNWCC was established, the final solution was in full operation. So we might as well ask, why so late? Well, one explanation, of course, is that there is a lack of information, and this is perfectly true. It was quite difficult to get accurate information, especially details, names of perpetrators. When it came to individual acts or abuse or murder in camps or in local actions, they knew, of course, the names of the Gauleiter, the leaders, and so forth. But for the more local, smaller crimes, they had many gaps. In fact, if you look at some of the early charge files, you'll see that there are many inaccuracies, many names that were simply unknown. And many of these repeat very sketchy information from reports that had been pouring into London since the beginning of the war. However, there was a constant flow of information from occupied Poland and from other occupied territories to London. There were channels from the underground feeding information all the time. So the types of crimes that were being perpetrated and the issues that the Allies faced were clear enough and demanded some kind of action. In fact, the Polish government in exile had set up its own war crimes office much earlier in the war, and it was sharing information not just with the British and American governments, but with the public as well, through a number of English language publications, one of which we see on the side there, probably the most famous, the mass extermination of Jews in German-occupied Europe. Aside from this, certain unofficial bodies had already been set up to tackle issues of international law and war crimes. For instance, the Cambridge Commission for Penal Reconstruction and Development, which had been set up following the conference in Cambridge of November 1941, and which issued a number of important reports and opinions. Also, the London International Assembly, set up under the auspices of the League of Nations Union, which set up a commission to study problems of war crimes already in March of 1942, and issued recommendations and later a 450-page report. So there was plenty of information on atrocities and war crimes, even if there were gaps, and legal experts were already tackling the problems of post-war justice, just outside of official structures. So a more convincing explanation really is simply the lack of political will on the part of the great powers. And in fact, I think you can see the UNWCC as a culmination of a long struggle by the smaller powers, those occupied by Nazi Germany, who fought a constant struggle to have Britain and the United States recognize the need to confront the atrocities and war crimes and to publicly declare their determination to punish the perpetrators after the war. This is a constant issue throughout the war. Issues of atrocities and war crimes were raised from the beginning by Poland and by others, the Czech government especially. But the British government and later the American government were reluctant to publicize them and consistently downplayed them. There are a number of reasons for this. One is the experience of the First World War, where atrocities had been exaggerated quite often for propaganda purposes. And the British government, and particularly the Foreign Office, felt that atrocity reports had largely been discredited by this. On top of this, there was the failure of the Leipzig war crimes trials after the First World War, is the ghost of the Leipzig war crimes trials, which had ended in pretty near failure with very few actual trials and few sentences, and also an unwillingness to divert resources from purely military objectives. This is a constant issue. Even when they're asked to simply bomb the tracks leading to Auschwitz, of course, they say that they cannot divert the needed aircraft for that. So another reason. Also, fear of reprisals against POWs and other British and American nationals in the camps. Of course, they didn't have peoples in occupied territories themselves to worry about. But I think underneath all of this was simply a strong desire not to take action. And if you look at the files of the Foreign Office, you see this quite often, especially in the case of the Holocaust, not to have to undertake rescue operations that could possibly lead to large-scale Jewish immigrations is one of the problems they refer to. So all in all, it fell to the exiled governments to force the issue to bring atrocities and war crimes to the attention of the public and to the agenda of the Allied powers, by this time, of course, known as the United Nations. And still, they encountered stiff opposition from the British government. So I will give a short kind of overview of some of the rocky road to the UNWCC, sort of underlining the difficulties that they faced. One of the early emanations of this problem of atrocities was a joint statement by the Polish and Czech governments on Nazi atrocities, which was made in November of 1940, where they condemn the expulsion of populations, banishment of hundreds and thousands of men and women to forced labor in Germany, mass executions and deportations to concentration camps, plundering of public and private property, extermination of the intellectual class and of cultural life, spoliation of treasures of science and art, and the persecution of all religious beliefs. This was followed by further statements by the Polish government denouncing the German occupation policies and denationalization. The British Foreign Office generally tried to discourage such statements, again feeling that publicizing atrocities was something that was already discredited and it would simply lead nowhere. And they tried to keep the British government at a distance from them. A year later or so, the British were taken by surprise by Roosevelt's declaration of the 25th of October 1941, denouncing atrocities by Germans. This was followed immediately by Churchill with his own declaration, in which he said, among other things, retribution for these crimes will henceforth take its place among the major purposes of the war. So finally, by late 1941, we have government leaders standing behind this. But of course, such declarations were certainly helpful, but they did not oblige their respective governments to take actually any action. They didn't specify any kind of policy. However, this did lead to the first unilateral action taken, which was the St. James's Palace Declaration of the 13th of January, 1942, which promised punishment of war crimes as a major aim of the Allies. The signatories of this were the governments of Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, Luxembourg, Norway, the Netherlands, Poland, and Yugoslavia. And they formed an inter-allied commission on the punishment of war crimes to pursue the aims of the declaration. However, it has to be pointed out that neither Great Britain nor the United States agreed to be signatories. Instead, they sent observers to the conference along with the Soviet Union and China, so still maintaining their distance from all of this. Meantime, of course, Nazi atrocities in the occupied territories were continuing unabated. The Wannsee Conference took place just 7 days after the St. James's Palace Declaration, which, of course, put the mechanisms of the final solution in place. And by the summer of 1942, Alarming reports were reaching London about Nazi extermination as a planned and deliberate action. There was a note presented to the governments of Great Britain, USA, and USSR by the Inter-Allied Commission on the Punishment for War Crimes, which said, amongst other things, the invaders' acts of oppression and terrorism have recently developed to such an extent and assumed such forms as to arouse the fear that the regime of occupation will assume an ever more barbarous and merciless character, not excluding the extermination of whole groups of peoples. So the alarms were growing louder. And from June to December of 1942, there is a rather controversial period in historiography, during which the news of Treblinka, Chełmno, and other places of mass murder was being received, absorbed, disbelieved, debated, and minimized among the Allies. All of this lasted until December of that year, when, after receiving further reports, the Polish government circulated a note addressed to the governments of the United Nations concerning mass extermination of Jews in Polish territories, which was then published as the pamphlet we saw earlier in January. This helped prompt the United Nations Declaration Against German Atrocities of December 17th, 1942, which finally acknowledged publicly the reality of Nazi extermination of Europe's Jews. So you can see what a long, drawn-out process it was simply to acknowledge that this was happening. And it was in the midst of this period, in October 7th of 1942, that plans for the UNWCC were first made public in a speech by the Lord Chancellor, Lord Simon, before Parliament. And I will read this out so you don't have to follow. The proposal is to set up with the least possible delay a United Nations Commission for the investigation of war crimes. The commission will be composed of nationals of the United Nations selected by their governments. The commission will investigate war crimes committed against nationals of the United Nations, recording the testimony available, and the commission will report from time to the governments of those nations cases in which such crimes appear to have been committed, naming and identified wherever possible the persons responsible. The commission should direct its attention in particular to organized atrocities. The investigation should cover war crimes of offenders irrespective of rank, and the aim will be to collect material supported wherever possible by depositions or by other documents to establish such crimes, especially where they are systematically perpetrated, and to name and identify those responsible for their perpetration. So this is a summary of what the UNWCC was intended to be. There are several things that I would like to call attention to here. One is the key role of the individual governments of the United Nations. The UNWCC was chaired by British, for sure, but it was composed of the representatives of the individual nations and was meant to report back to those governments. So there was a kind of a more democratic and involved formulation there. It's not mentioned here, but emphasis of the UNWCC would furthermore be on national courts, and this is something that had been debated and discussed among the various unofficial bodies up to this point, that it made more sense to turn these trials over to national courts and not to try to set up an international body. The main tasks would be investigation, recording testimonies, and identifying perpetrators. And again, not mentioned, but a further and very important task would also be to debate legal definitions and procedures concerning war crimes, and making recommendations to strengthen national laws and international law. Also important here, I think, is the stress on naming and identifying all perpetrators regardless of rank. So this was intended to preclude the defense of just following orders and to include people from the very top down to the very ordinary German and Axis citizens. Finally, I think important here is the emphasis on organized atrocities and crimes that are systematically perpetrated. It's a fundamental recognition that the Axis atrocities were more than just a result of the chaos of war, but that they were deliberate plans to use mass murder, torture, forced labor, incarceration, rape, and other atrocities as means to further war aims. This was something that had been staunchly rejected by the Foreign Office and by other government bodies, and particularly in their unwillingness to see the wholesale murder of European Jews as a single deliberate plan of extermination. So this was a great step forward in recognizing Nazi atrocities for what they were. Still, of course, it would be another year before the UNWCC would be formally established. It was only established on the 20th of October, 1943. And as I said before, not until January of 1944 that the work would officially begin. One reason for the further delay underlines the political hazards involved. The governments had been anxious, of course, to have the USSR join as well, and there were lengthy negotiations, but these eventually broke down. The problem was that Moscow demanded individual participation of the Baltic states of Belarus and Ukraine as representatives of the Soviet Union, as the British themselves had included Canada and Australia, which were then Commonwealth dominions. And this, of course, would have signaled recognition on the part of the British and Americans of the Soviet Union's absorption of the Baltic states, which they were unwilling to do at this time. So, in other words, the establishment of the UNWCC should be seen as the culmination of a long and difficult political process, not just a juridical one. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure and the work of the UNWCC. It was comprised of 16 member states: Australia, Belgium, Canada, China, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, Ethiopia, France, Greece, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Poland, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Yugoslavia. Most of those, of course, under occupation. And the work of the UNWCC was divided between national offices and 3 central committees. So each of the allied nations and dominions had its own office, the task of which was to gather evidence and draw up charge files or indictments for Axis crimes against their own nationals. These were to be submitted to Committee 1 for review, and you can find this in our archives in folders 1 through 32, the charge files. Most of the charges were against Germans, but there were also charges against Albanians, Bulgarians, Italians, Hungarians, Romanians, and Japanese. So each of the national offices chose a delegate to the central office. The Polish delegates were Dr. Stefan Glaser from 43 until April of 44, Dr. Tadeusz Cyprian from April of 44 to September of 45, Dr. Mieczysław Scherer from September of 45 to December of 46, and then Colonel Dr. Marian Muszkat from February 1947 on. They also had Jerzy Litowski as the head of the Polish office until September of 45. In September of 45, of course, the Polish National Office had to be transferred to the Provisional Government for National Unity, as the government in exile had lost recognition just a month or two before. But it continued work unabated. So aside from the national offices, there was Committee 1, the Committee of Facts and Evidence, whose task it was to examine charge files and determine if there was sufficient evidence to recommend trial, and if there was, to add the names of the perpetrators to lists of criminals, which I will talk about in a moment. Then Committee 2, tasked with the function of enforcement, were all measures considered necessary to ensure the detection, apprehension, trial, and punishment of persons responsible for war crimes. This was an important function. This is one of the failures of the Leipzig trials in the First World War, was that they were not able to actually lay hands on most of the people named. Then Committee 3, the Advisory Committee, which was to answer and investigate all questions of policy and law related to war crimes and to the UNWCC. Very important committee, which worked on all of the legal issues involved in war crimes and trying war crimes in this new context. Polish delegates were all members of Committee 3, and Jerzy Litowski himself was secretary to Committee 1. There were also Far Eastern and Pacific subcommissions and other committees for public relations, finance, and so forth. And all of these have quite a number of records, minutes, correspondences, etc. in the archive. So it is, again, a rich trove of information on how these committees functioned and what they debated. Now, the central document produced by the UNWCC was the charge file, which was prepared by the individual national offices. It contained registration number, date, issuing nation, and the nation charged, as you can see here. The name or names of perpetrators with their rank and occupation, or their organization, such as the SS. Date and place of the commission of the crime. Enumeration of crimes, which referred to a master list made up by the third committee, and to national law. So you see here references to 1, murder and massacres, and 3, torture of civilians, and then underneath the criminal code, presumably Polish criminal code. Then a short statement of facts, and then particulars of evidence and support and notes on the case. In some cases, there's only a page or so of explanation of the crime and maybe a few testimonies, but there are quite a number of these that have many, many pages of detailed notes, witness statements, and so forth. Over the four and a half years of its existence, the UNWCC national offices produced over 8,000 of these charge files, naming over 36,000 suspects. The Polish National Office itself submitted 1,564 case files concerning crimes that ranged from individual acts of ill treatment or complicity in deportation to massive lists of concentration camp guards, capos, and administrators, to mass murders, summary executions, persecution of clergy and of intelligentsia, looting and destruction of property and monuments. 380 of their case files, in fact, concern persecution and mass murders of Polish Jews, so that's nearly a quarter of all their case files, and 131 that concern forced labor in Germany. I have a couple to show. I'm just going to briefly whiz by these. This one is a further page about Treblinka, and you can see that there's quite a detailed description of it, and a map which they somehow had. This is filed in April of 1944, so quite reasonably early on. There's also charge files, for example, of this is charge file number 37, the first one, dealing with summary executions of Polish men accused of sexual relations with German women. On the second page is the list of the names that were included in this, and you can see the names of Himmler and other high-ranking officials. So many of these charge files dealt with the very top. Some of them, in fact, named Hitler himself. But if you look at the third charge file, this is one against Johann Bella, a farmer, who was accused of abuse and murder of a Polish forced laborer. So many of these charge files, and in fact, probably the majority, really deal with very small individual cases and ordinary people, farmers, foremen, and so forth. These charge files were submitted to Committee 1, which judged if it had sufficient grounds to recommend proceeding to trial. If positive, they then added the names of the suspects to lists of wanted war criminals. There were 80 lists in all, compiled by the UNWCC's Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects, abbreviated as CROCAS. And these lists were distributed to Allied military commands who were responsible for identifying and apprehending the war criminals on the lists. With suspects in custody and indictments in hands, the liberated nations were then able to begin cases and to prosecute Axis war criminals in their own national courts. They received advice as well from UNWCC experts, especially from Committee 3, who helped to establish many common procedures and legal frameworks for the post-war trials. And trials were then reported back to the UNWCC. There's 65 folders of reports on war trials, national war trials after the war. So quite a few, hundreds of them, including, of course, the trial of Rudolf Hess and others in Poland. So as you can see, then there is a clear continuity between the work of the UNWCC and many of the post-war trials. And even while the Nuremberg trials themselves were quite separate from the UNWCC, they did make use of evidence from the UNWCC and from expertise. The closing down of the UNWCC. All of this was going quite strong until suddenly in March of 1948 it was shut down and abruptly disbanded by the Allies, mainly under pressure from the United States. Why? Well, politics of the Cold War, fear of communism spreading to West Germany, the need to use reformed former Nazi officials to bolster administration of the Federal Republic, and also perhaps because the UNWCC had been eclipsed by the more politically spectacular Nuremberg trials, although in the end the Nuremberg trials failed to achieve many of the goals of the UNWCC in many respects. For examples, in terms of underlining the responsibility of all perpetrators, irrespective of rank. It has been quite easy to overlook the UNWCC due to its premature closure and to its silencing, but it represents an enormous effort by many of Europe's best legal minds of the day to tackle the problems of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and other horrors of modern warfare that have been ushered in by Nazi Germany and its allies, crimes that were more or less unprecedented at the time and which have continued to plague us down to the present day. Those who were involved in the UNWCC would go on to occupy prominent positions in legal communities and courts throughout Europe and America, and their expertise would inform both national and international law in many ways. Now, all of the evidence of this struggle to confront this new brutal reality of the Second World War and the post-war world is visible here in the archive of the UNWCC as well as in other archives such as the Foreign Office, and it can give us an invaluable vantage on the political as well as the legal obstacles that stand in the way of addressing the problems of war crimes and atrocities. Thank you very much. I will now turn over the floor to my colleague,